Probably the hardest thing you'll ever do is try to get the job in industry, mostly because you have to overcome this barrier of convincing the hiring manager and panel of people that you interview with that you will actually be successful in transitioning to industry. Industry is so different than academia, and that the timeline of things and projects and deadlines is very rapid compared to what you experience in academia. Yes, I know you have deadlines for grants and that type of thing, but it's slower compared to what we experience in industry. So convincing someone that you will be successful in doing that is a difficult thing to do.
There are a lot of different potential roles in industry. I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. There's sort of the default in terms of coming out of your postdoc, most in line with what you do is sort of going into a scientist type role in industry. And that job description isn't necessarily that different, and your current skill set probably applies the most closely to that. Now, that for the MDs, there's this total other side, which is clinical research, which those of you who have done clinical research in academia, you sort of see the tip of the iceberg on that. Is that you can in an academic setting as a physician, what you're doing is you're usually taking care of patients on clinical trials, either as an investigator or as a sub-investigator. And what that involves, of course, is knowing the protocols and being on the front lines, taking care of your patients, and always considering your patients, primarily and their interests above anything else. On the industry side, there's this enormous architecture behind running clinical trials that's really informed by the fact that it's such a heavily regulated environment. And that's something where even the initial transition there, if you're interested in clinical development, everybody knows that you don't have no clue about any of it. So all really that they're looking for is you're looking for smart people. Smart people who can learn quickly, have good clinical judgment, and who are interested in making that transition.
Skill set that's applicable to the job you're applying for is number one. That's going to be the first thing that gets you noticed by your hiring manager. And then, of course, if you do your research on the company that you are applying to, you wouldn't believe the candidates that we get that come in who have no idea really what the company does.
There's doing your homework in terms of what is the job that you're applying for? What is the skill set that really is required to succeed in that role? Developing experience in a given technology that may translate really well, and you take that module over with you and you're already up and running, be something where you have a very given skill set that for at least the bioanalytical group will be a very valuable tool, and you can find a job that's looking at that. But either off the bat or somewhere down the road, there's a bigger question as to kind of where do you want to get and how do your skills, your interests, and your motivations line up with that. So for the clinical development side, like I was mentioning, is that people know that in the initial transition, even for heavily experienced trialists, there's some folks who I know from UCSF and from Stanford who have made that transition to development after 5 or 10 years as being part of faculty here. And even that transition, people benefit from being really humble because you're an expert in your own area already, but you're stepping into a role that you will never be the master of because the determinants of the framework is so different. So that's a part where doing your homework is, okay, what part of the skill set can you develop initially that overlaps? The one thing that I heard for clinical research, clinical development was that, hey, the more experience that you have with clinical research, that's at least the part that translates. All the rest of us can be totally different, but the more that you've participated directly in with clinical trials, that part will translate over the most directly. You don't always want to just be kind of hedging your bets. It's really something where you want to try to figure out as early as you can, what do you really want to do? And then try to line up your experiences to that. There is a strong predisposition to hiring people with very strong scientific pedigrees. And that means both publication record as well as what institutions that you're kind of coming from. But then beyond that is almost more important is there's a part about doing your homework as to being humble, but also really motivated and having kind of the engagement during the day of the interviews, knowing that people know you have no clue what you're getting into. So it's sort of that balance, and the most general piece of doing your homework will serve you well.
The all-day interview, I think that's a great idea. Really see how someone fits into the group. And the way we do it in our group is everyone is participating in the interview process. So it's important to get everyone's aspect and to maybe separate the candidate with small groups of people. So their questions that they ask the candidate are going to be different. And we listen to all of that feedback, and so that we can choose the best candidate. And it's always someone who has a good sense of communication, because at the end of the day, a lot of different people can do the job, and you're competing with all those different people. You need to set yourself apart, and that's one way to do it. In my group, we're very, very careful about who we hire, because we want to recruit people who we think are good team players. And at a company, you're all focused on one goal, and that is getting whatever product it may be out the door. We do product development. So sometimes we will actually hire people who have less skills, but they seem like they fit into the group better. They have a better attitude. They're willing to learn. We can teach them the way we want them to do a process, and they're pliable and they're amenable to it. And in my eyes, it's actually better to find someone who's bright but doesn't necessarily have the training that you need and teach them. So if you show that you're a candidate who can learn and you're open to new ideas, and it's part of that interacting with other people and being able to communicate. If you enter into a company, and let's say you're at a scientist level and you're proficient at that, there's a lot more opportunity for you to move laterally within the company into other departments if they already know you. So you're already way ahead of anyone else who's probably applying for the position, unless they're really well qualified.
I know very smart postdocs who are in project management, in regulatory affairs, in bioanalytics, in kind of the translational part of biomarkers. So there are a whole host of different potential opportunities, and each of those has their own balance of the scientific content versus kind of the novel skill set. In general, most people don't have the skill set to directly do one of those other roles. So it's much more straightforward, is that you know you're going to be an expert at what you're doing during your postdoc, and then making a transition that then whatever company you join leverages your experience, but then you use that period of time to sort of figure out what all those roles are, to triangulate what makes sense for you overall in terms of your long-term career arc and trajectory. And that's what the people who I've really seen being successful have managed to do, is you come in, company benefits, you're a smart person, you work hard, and then particularly for a medium or large-sized company, there are always opportunities to do pretty much anything. And then it's figuring out, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue on the path in research, which some very smart people are doing that? Then do you want to take one of these other branches, and then there's too many, I think. Each of those roles has their own kind of benefits and trade-offs, and they're all required for the success of any of the companies. The companies themselves are quite different, all the way from kind of research-oriented small companies to large pharma. And so the roles that are going to exist in those companies and then the lateral mobility may vary. In general, I've seen a lot of very easy transitions in medium and large companies, because there tend to be a lot of opportunities and a lot of positions that will come up pretty much on a continual basis. Some of it matters, do you want to work in the same area, or are you willing to work on something else altogether? But then aside from that, even at some small companies, at 5' right now, there are folks who were doing research for 5-10 years who transitioned into project management roles, usually starting on research project management, and then you can actually even end up working on the clinical side. So I think the roles, there are just a ton of them. The best way to figure out what they are is to talk to people doing them. Getting access to that broad range is a little bit difficult unless you have social contacts kind of in the current framework. So it's much easier for most of us to do that once you have some sort of connection being part of a company where those roles exist and you see what those job responsibilities are like.
Someone who can solve problems or be capable, you can do a lot of different things at a small company, and the structure is always looser, less defined, and basically the job just needs to get done. So that's a nice place for someone who likes to be a problem solver and do a lot of different things. As you start to move into companies that are larger, there's, of course, a lot more vertical structure. And things slow down a little bit because there are more processes to be reviewed and that type of thing, red tape. Still, though, in comparison to academia, it's much faster. So there is a lot more structure, and moving up the ladder becomes more difficult. So in comparison, when I worked at a company that was about 300 people versus 1,000 people, your ability to move up really gets slowed down, actually. Unless the company is really growing in a space where you're an expert in that space, then of course you may get that opportunity, but the actual process of moving up can be a little bit slower. Not as much access to people at the top when you move into a larger company, so you don't get necessarily a chance to chat with the VP of, product development necessarily, or of research, especially if the company has a lot of different projects going on in different sites. So you can kind of tend to be siloed into an area when you get to companies that are very large. Smaller companies, you tend to have access to the people who are at the top who are making decisions and strategy decisions. And it becomes easier to actually introduce your ideas if you have ideas for how to move the company in different directions. And a lot of times that's accepted. So it's important to think about what might fit with your personality and what you want out of an experience in industry.
Joining growing companies is probably always the sweet spot. And that's something where then the opportunities continue to grow. It gives you the greatest amount of flexibility, and particularly if you work hard and perform well, then the opportunities are probably maximized for yourself. It's quite different if you're talking about a biotech company or, big pharma, because what does process mean? Process there's a certain amount of process that's a good thing, is that certain amount of process is that you actually know how to do something, you've done it before, so somebody's thought about what is the best way to actually try to do this, and if that's not the best way, you tweak it. That sometimes in a very regulated environment becomes an extensive, that this must be done within X number of steps, has to go through all these people, and that's sort of where probably there's too much process, but that's a good established workflows, hierarchies, numbers of people. There are benefits to that too. There's support. There is a wealth of experience and expertise that is probably too full in very large companies or medium-sized companies, which may not be there in small companies. But that small-large is sort of trumped almost completely by what's the focus and kind of what role you have there. Because ultimately, I would go back to, no matter academics, industry, what are you planning to do, and how does that job that you are signing up for fit with your anticipation of what you're hoping to do? And in industry, that's something where, again, in a scientist role, like we were talking about as you start off, those expectations are probably pretty closely aligned to what you expect they will be. There is a concession, absolutely, of you may not get, particularly if the company, large company or small company, changes what the strategic focus is going to be, you may or may not have control over what that's going to be. And that's a very big difference from industry versus academia, where you're running your lab and you get to choose that piece. That being said, the small or large, that's a risk at both. And that's probably one of the biggest differences of academics and industry, of you getting to work on what you choose.
That's a risk of going into industry. It's being able to read what's going on around you, look at the forest and see what's happening. And it's an accepted risk because you can jump to another company. And it depends on how the company's managed. So you need to look and see what they're doing. Are they well funded? Do they have products? Companies that don't have products yet, of course, are really unstable. So they can fold. You want to choose a company that, looks like it's run well, by people who are obviously smart financially, have good ideas, have products, and are growing.
In the non-kind of traditional science side of things, there are numerous opportunities for lateral mobility. But then there's a piece as to, do you get to control what you work on? And that's the part where I think you absolutely make a potential big concession in terms of moving to industry. And that's something where, if you're really invested in a particular disease area, and you're working for a small company, and my personal experience is that, everything in the small companies is really about making sure that you, very much like a small lab, secure sources of funding. And that's something where if you've got a niche that you're really invested in, that you want to work on a very particular thing, finding another one of those may be a challenge depending on what you're working on. And so that is absolutely a risk. And then as you move up the pyramid, finding jobs without having to move at a certain point can also get to be a challenge depending on where you are. A little bit less so if you're in one of the hot spots, but if you're not, if you're in LA, you're in San Diego, it is very plausible that at some point in your career that advancement may have a trade-off of needing to go somewhere else. So those kinds of stability of being in one place for a long period of time, being able to work on a consistent thing, I think that is a very big difference from industry and academia in terms of what the expectation is. The thing I would say is that titles aren't intrinsically important in any fashion, except they are indirectly related to two things, which are compensation, salary, and then secondarily that they're indirectly related to advancement.
I think you should look at the title and think about the role and the company, because you can have someone who is a manager level at a very large company and they're doing the work of a VP at a small company. So it's just a matter of looking at the responsibilities of the position. So you shouldn't let the title deter you.